Hey friends, we have 5 living generations. Many times those 5 living generations are a part of the church, and guess what? They don't get along. This podcast is how to help the generations be in a healthy place.
Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. E2 is devoted to coaching your elder team to win by providing biblical and practical resources in authentic relationships. E2 wants nothing more than to equip you to move God's kingdom forward in the place you're serving Jesus. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
Hey friends, welcome back to the podcast of E2 Effective Elders. And as always, we say thanks at the very beginning of the podcast to CDF Capital, a tremendous investor in this ministry. They have been partners with us for many years, and CDF Capital cares about you, the leader of the local church. Today, we're going to talk about the generations that are present within a church. We have 5 living generations in America today, and hopefully those 5 living generations are a part of your church. You know, a church with 5 living generations would be called a multi-generational church. But what we're exploring today is how to make those generations integrated. We want the local church to be more than just multi-generational. We want it to be intergenerational, where people who are older are integrating their lives with those who are younger. And that's what we will explore in these few moments that we have with one another. Now, as we develop this, what I want to talk about are what I call SEEs. And SEE is a significant emotional event that took place in and among a generation while they were growing up, while they're growing up into adulthood. And these significant emotional events had an impact on their lives, shaping who they were later to become. So I'm going to start with the oldest generation, and we sometimes call them builders. And the builders are those who were around as children during the Great Depression or during World War II. And the significant emotional events that shaped their lives as children and teenagers happened to be the Great Depression, happened to be World War II, the Korean conflict, and the Cold War. That generation was impacted in a huge way. Think with me for a moment. Builders, those who are older. Because of the Great Depression, when they were children growing up, that generation tends to save up and delay gratification. They pay what for that new washer and dryer? That's right, cash. They pay cash for that car. These individuals, because they experienced World War II, many of them not only having gone the war, but many of them knowing friends from high school who died in the war, this generation tends to be incredibly patriotic. Huge patriotism deep within their heart, mind, and soul. So the builders, the oldest living generation, they tend to be patriotic, they tend to pay cash, they tend to delay gratification, and one more thing, they will not coddle, they will not cater to younger generations like mine, and we're the next younger. We happen to be called boomers. And boomers were born after World War II, but before 1966. And my generation, as a kid growing up, as a teenager, the significant emotional events that affected our generation were things like the sexual revolution, where people had immediate gratification. Abortion was made legal during our years growing up. Also, we would say that prayer coming out of school, where schools started that shift away from those things that were considered Christian in orientation. Vietnam was an enormous, significant emotional event in our years growing up, we were wondering if we were going to be drafted. Remember, the military draft was still an enormous part of our growing up years. Many people defected. They left America. They moved to Canada to avoid the draft. They didn't want to go to Vietnam. That impacted us. As a matter of fact, how so? What those significant emotional events? Because our parents kept telling us no, they were going to save up, they were going to pay cash. We wanted in 3 years what it took our parents 30 years to accumulate. We wanted it, and we wanted it now. As a matter of fact, we were not afraid to work, to accumulate, to amass, to not only have stuff, but to have a title, to have position, to have recognition. So our generation even still works to this day. Many people, not because they have to, but because they want to work. So boomers, there were significant emotional events in their lives, my life, that impacted the way that we are today. The next younger generation would be Gen X. Gen X. Gen X, born 1965, thereabouts, to 1976. Now, keep in mind that these years oftentimes overlap, and there's a reflection of each of these generations when people are on the periphery of the generation. So Gen X, this generation is rarely spoken of. They're kind of forgotten. And what you and I want to understand is this generation is parenting. Not only are they still raising their kids, but they're taking care of their aging parents. So this generation is stressed out. They have aging parents many times who need care of some form or fashion, and they have children, teenagers still growing up, or little ones. Gen X. Now, Gen X also, about them, what they experienced, some of their significant emotional events, that generation experienced the onboarding of what we call no-fault divorce. And many homes became victims of no-fault divorce. They saw their parents suddenly separate, and that home, that family was destroyed. So what we saw in Gen X, the new definition of a family, and it was amplified by a television sitcom called Friends. Friends became a very popular show for Gen X because that was a definition of a real family. You had friends who would never walk out on you. You had friends who would never call divorce out in that social circle. So no-fault divorce impacted Gen X. The internet was invented supposedly by one of our vice presidents back in that era when those kids were growing up. But what we did see was the advent of the personal computer truly becoming that. Apple with their early forms of computer, as well as Microsoft, personal computing became pretty popular not only in the home but at school. The internet only fueled that all the further. And Gen X grew up with that. It had a significant impact on the way that they do life. And by the way, Gen X, they do not want their kids to grow up and become like their parents, boomers. Likewise, Gen X, they do not want their kids to grow up and become millennials. They don't like the millennials. And millennials, this age group, the next younger still, was born about 1977 to about 1995. Keep in mind, again, there's a little overlap at both ends. The oldest right now is around 40 years of age. And so sometimes people who are in their late 30s, early 40s, they've got a little bit of pieces of both millennials and Gen X in their thinking. Now, some significant emotional events. Well, when millennials were growing up, think with me, 9/11 happened. That was a significant emotional event. And not only 9/11 happened, but we saw the acceptance of same-sex relationships, even to the point of where the Supreme Court made it legal in America for people of the same gender to be married to one another. All of that happened while millennials were growing up into young adulthood. We assume that this generation is very tech savvy, but that's not the case. They are tech dependent, but not necessarily tech savvy. They are video driven. They are visually driven. They are not into print form. They are not necessarily into the reading of books. They tend to be driven by video and visual. This generation also, they are historically delayed, meaning they put off. They have put off college, they have put off marriage, they have put off children, they have put off buying their own home. When I say put off, all I mean is that they are not doing that nearly as quickly as previous generations. There's more of a delay factor. Why is that? Many times we boomers wanted our children and grandchildren, again, where we wanted something in 3 years, what it took our parents 30 years to accumulate. We want to bless our children and our grandchildren in that way many times as well. So kids and grandkids, they've just waited around for mom and dad and grandma and grandpa to kind of deliver the goods. And we see millennials delaying some of these particular major life decisions. Now, the next generation, we have Generation Z, the youngest of all 5 living generations. Generation Z was born 2010 and they are younger. My grandchildren are Generation Z. Now, they don't remember 9/11 at all. It happened long before they would be able to even recognize that. Many of them born after the year 2001. Their significant emotional events, remember, they're still growing up. Some of the impacting events in their growing up years now would be the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. And all across America, many people lost their jobs. When they lost their jobs, they lost their car, they lost their truck, even lost their home. They had to move out of the apartment or the condominium. And because they were suddenly overnight in need, this generation already, right here, Gen Z, already, they have become very frugal, very frugal. As a matter of fact, 12% of Generation Z is already saving. They have emergency funds. Some are even saving for retirement. Many Generation Z are putting off getting a driver's license because they do not want the expense of car insurance, which their parents, Gen X, some older millennials, are demanding that their kids pay for themselves. So their frugality, because of being impacted by financial travesty in their childhood, they are putting off some of the more larger ticket items when it comes to finances. They're learning to be frugal. They save. What's also very interesting is that they desire a stable workforce. They're hoping that there will be a stable economy wherein they can find a good job and be able to make ends meet. So Gen Z, they already have some SEEs shaping the way they think, and how we think determines the way we live. Now, all that being said, there we have a quick review of the 5 living generations and this concept of SEEs, significant emotional events. All of us have them. Here's what you and I got to understand. If we're going to get older people to get along with younger people, we have to understand these events and how they shape their lives. There's a great book that was written in the 1990s called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I read this book long, long ago. I don't remember all 7 of the habits, but one I remember vividly. And that habit says, seek first to understand before being understood. So before I can demand that my grandchildren understand why I am the way I am, I have to seek to understand their lives, what has shaped their thinking. Before young people can demand, hey, those old people, their songs, their flags, etc., before we can make demands on them, maybe it would do us good, those who are younger, to understand that many of them had friends who died in World War II to defend not only our nation, but to stop the advance of Nazism around the world. We have to seek first to understand why people are the way that they are, how people act the way they act and think, before we demand people understand us. And that demands a selfless attitude. And that's looking like Jesus. As a matter of fact, what you and I want to remember is that in intergenerational ministry or life, there's a great example between Paul the Apostle and his young adopted son in the faith, Timothy. Their paths crossed in Acts chapter 16 when they became known to one another personally. And then Paul later on in Philippians chapter 2 verse 20, he says of Timothy, I've got no one else like him who is so helpful to me in my ministry. It's obvious that Paul valued young Timothy. And then in his letter to the Corinthian church, his first letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, he says in verse 17, I'm sending to you Timothy, my son in the faith, whom I love. So look at those three observations. Paul knew Timothy personally, valued Timothy greatly, and loved Timothy unconditionally. Known, valued, loved. What if we who are older did that with those who are younger? And what if those who are younger got to know we who are older and valued us in their lives, and they loved us unconditionally? Can you imagine how healthy churches would be, and the fighting, the bickering, the disrespect would come to an end between the generations, and we wouldn't only be a multiple generational church, multi-generational, no, we would be truly integrated and become intergenerational in our ministry. That's what elders can teach in the local church, and not only teach with our words, but we can teach by our example. Learn to do that. It's essential to reach and keep the next generation. Join us at the Huddle, October 9 and 10. Just go to our website, e2elders.org, and on our landing page, you'll see an icon for the Huddle, a national gathering of elders, church leaders, their spouses here in the Indy Metroplex area this fall. There's going to be a workshop for reaching and keeping the next generation. And as elders, we need to know how to do that. Come and join us. So friend us on Facebook, E2 Elders. Visit us on our YouTube channel, E2 Elders. Get the word out. People can subscribe for our podcast on SoundCloud at E2 Elders. Let's all lead well. Pass this podcast on as an encouragement to still others. The blessings of the Lord be yours.